The day Louise Hart turned 32, she did not receive a single birthday greeting, and on that same morning she found herself standing in a line of women half her age, all of them pinching color into their cheeks and smoothing the fronts of their Sunday dresses, waiting to be looked over like cattle at auction in the dusty little town of Millhaven, Texas, in the spring of 1882. The bride showing, as the townspeople called it, though the more genteel among them preferred the phrase social introduction, had become something of an institution in Millhaven. The cattle ranches and homesteads that stretched across the surrounding plains were full of lonely men who had come west with ambition and calloused hands but without wives, and so every few months, when enough unmarried women had arrived by stagecoach or been rounded up from the surrounding communities, the town held an informal gathering at the general store where men could present themselves and women could be presented. It was a practical arrangement, people said. Practical was the word they used when they did not want to examine a thing too closely. Louise had not planned to be here. She had come to Millhaven 8 months ago to care for her ailing aunt, a stubborn woman named Clara who had survived 3 husbands and a prairie fire, but had not survived the winter of 1881. Clara had left Louise the small house on the edge of town, a house with a leaking roof and a garden that had gone to weeds, and a sum of money that was dwindling faster than Louise liked to think about. The schoolteacher position she had hoped to secure had gone to a younger woman who had arrived from Illinois with a certificate and letters of recommendation, and the seamstress work that Louise had taken in kept her fed but nothing more. When Mrs. Aldridge, who organized these social introductions, had come to her door with that particular smile of pitying helpfulness, Louise had said yes before she could talk herself out of it. She regretted it the moment she stepped into the line. The other women were young. Some of them were barely past their teenage years, 17 and 19 and 21, their faces bright with nervousness and possibility. Louise stood among them in her best dress, which was a deep blue with white buttons at the collar, her dark hair pinned up neatly, and she was aware, acutely, painfully aware, that she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had already lived a considerable portion of her life, who had fine lines at the corners of her brown eyes, and who carried herself with the kind of quiet self-possession that men in this time and place sometimes mistook for stubbornness. The men filed in through the front of Hargrove's general store. There were perhaps 20 of them, ranging from sunburned young cowboys to broad-shouldered older men who looked at the row of women with the calculating eyes of men accustomed to making assessments. Mrs. Aldridge stood at the front of the room with her clipboard and her tightly curled gray hair, and called out names and ages in a voice that carried the cheerful authority of a schoolmarm. Miss Jenny Pruitt, age 18, originally of St. Louis. Jenny Pruitt stepped forward and smiled brilliantly, and 3 men moved in her direction at once. Miss Clara Dawes, age 20, originally of San Antonio. More movement, more eager steps from the men's side of the room. Louise watched this and felt something she would later describe to herself as a quiet closing, like a door being gently shut inside her chest. She had known, logically, that she would not fare well in this particular venue. She had known it the way she knew that the roof leaked, the way she knew the money was running out. But knowing a thing and standing inside the truth of it were entirely different experiences. Miss Louise Hart, age 32, originally of Nashville, Tennessee. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but Louise felt every one of them like a separate small stone. She stepped forward as she had watched the others do, and she looked out at the room, and what she saw was a collection of men who were already in conversation with Jenny Pruitt and Clara Dawes and the other girls, men who had already made their calculations and found their answers, and not a single one of them turned in her direction. Mrs. Aldridge moved briskly onto the next name, and Louise stepped back into line, and she thought, very quietly and very firmly, that she was going to go home after this and fix that leaking roof herself if she had to, and she was going to write to her sister in Nashville and ask if there was any work to be found there. And she was absolutely never going to do anything like this again, as long as she lived. She was gathering her resolve around her like a shawl when a voice came from the back of the room. It was a low voice, unhurried, with the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to being heard without having to raise his volume. "I would like to speak with Miss Hart if she is willing." The room did not go entirely silent, but there was a definite shift in the noise, a kind of collective turning, the way prairie grass moves when the wind changes direction. Louise turned too, though she was careful not to do it too quickly. The man standing at the back of the room was tall, with the kind of lean, deliberate build that came from years of physical work. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a year or two on either side of that, with dark hair that had begun to silver at the temples and a face that had been lived in tan by the sun, marked by weather but not unkind. His eyes, when they met hers across the crowded room, were a steady, particular gray, and he was looking at her not the way a man looks at a thing he is considering purchasing, but the way a man looks at something he has been searching for and is surprised and relieved to finally find. He wore clean clothes, which was notable dark trousers and a shirt that had been laundered and pressed, a vest the color of good leather, and a hat he was currently holding in his hands rather than wearing, which Louise would later think was a detail that said a great deal about him. He had taken his hat off inside. In 1882, in a Texas cattle town, in a room full of men who were essentially shopping for wives, this man had taken his hat off. "I would be pleased to speak with you," Louise said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. His name was Arthur McCrae, and he owned a cattle ranch called the Double Bar M some 12 miles northeast of Millhaven, and he had a reputation in the surrounding country that Louise had not known about because she had been in Millhaven for only 8 months and had spent most of those months caring for her aunt, and then grieving her aunt, and then trying to keep her own head above water. She learned some of this reputation over the next hour, sitting at a small table that Mrs. Aldridge had set up near the side window of the general store, where the afternoon light came in warm and golden, and the noise of the other introductions happening around them faded into something that was almost companionable background texture. Arthur McCrae, she learned, was not a man who talked simply to fill space. He asked her questions, and then waited for her answers with what seemed to be genuine attention. He asked where she had come from and what she had done there, and how she had come to be in Millhaven, and he listened to the story of her Aunt Clara without the glazed politeness that most men adopted when women spoke of things that did not directly concern them. He asked her what she thought about things. He asked what she had read recently. When she told him she had been working through a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that her aunt had left behind, he said, without a trace of condescension, that he had a volume of Thoreau on his own shelf that he had been meaning to get back to. "You have a library?" she asked. "A bookshelf," he said, with what she was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of dry humor. "I would not call it a library. My housekeeper, Mrs. Boone, would call it that pile of reading material that collects dust. But yes." Louise felt something loosen in her chest, some tight thing she had been holding for a long time without realizing she was holding it. She looked at this man across the small table and thought that he was interesting. Not handsome in a conventional, clean-featured way, but interesting, the kind of face you wanted to keep looking at because you suspected there was more behind it than was immediately apparent. "Why me?" she asked, because she was 32 years old and had not survived this long by being coy about things that mattered. "There are younger women here. Several of them are very pretty." Arthur McCrae looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes, and he did not seem embarrassed by the directness of the question. He seemed, if anything, to appreciate it. "I came here today," he said slowly, "because my ranch foreman told me I was going to turn into a strange, solitary old man if I did not at least try to meet someone. So I came." And I watched those young women be introduced, and I thought about what it would be like to spend a winter evening talking to them, and I could not quite make myself believe in it. And then they called your name and you stepped forward and you did not smile for the room. He paused. Everyone else smiled for the room. You looked at it, like you were measuring it and finding it somewhat lacking and deciding whether it was worth your time. Louise opened her mouth and then closed it again. I thought, he continued, that I would very much like to know what a woman like that was thinking. The afternoon light lay golden between them, and somewhere behind them Jenny Prout laughed at something a young cowboy was saying, bright and musical and entirely uncomplicated. And Louise thought that she was, against all reasonable expectation, not entirely unhappy that she had come to this ridiculous event today. Arthur McCrae asked if he might call on her, properly, the following Sunday. Louise said that he might. They shook hands when they parted, which was not what was typically done, but seemed to be what both of them were most comfortable with. And as Louise walked home in the late afternoon through the dusty Millhaven streets, she was aware that something had shifted in the landscape of her life, though she could not yet have told you what or in which direction. The following Sunday, Arthur McCrae arrived at Louise's door at 10 o'clock in the morning, which was exactly what he had said he would do. He was driving a buckboard wagon rather than riding horseback, and he had brought a basket that contained, he explained without any ceremony, cornbread that his housekeeper, Mrs. Boone, had made, and a jar of preserves and a tin of coffee. He had also brought, with what she would come to recognize as characteristic thoughtfulness, a hammer and a box of nails, because he had noticed when they shook hands the previous Sunday that she had a small callus on her right palm that was inconsistent with needlework. "Your roof," he said simply, when she looked at the tools with raised eyebrows. "You heard about my roof. Mrs. Aldridge mentioned it to the blacksmith who mentioned it to my foreman who mentioned it to me," he said. "Small towns." "Small towns," Louise agreed. She did not tell him she could fix it herself. She had been telling herself she could fix it herself for 3 weeks, and the bucket in the back room was still catching drips. She helped him carry the ladder around to the back of the house and handed up shingles when he asked for them. And while he worked they talked, easily, the conversation moving the way good conversations do, finding its own current and following it without forcing. She learned that he had come to Texas from Missouri 12 years ago, in 1870, with $500, 2 horses, and a specific idea about what he wanted to build. He had built it. The Double Bar M ran 800 head of cattle now, and employed 12 men, and the house on the property was solid and well constructed, and had a porch that faced west so you could watch the sunsets over the plain. She learned that he had been married once before, briefly, to a woman named Ellen who had come from a respectable Kansas City family, and had lasted 2 winters on the ranch before concluding that she was not suited to this kind of life. The divorce had been costly in multiple ways, and had not been bitter exactly, but had left a particular scar that Louise could recognize in the way he talked around the edges of it. Ellen had gone back east and remarried, and as far as he knew was content. "I am sorry," Louise said. "It was the right ending for both of us," he said. "I am not certain we should have begun." She understood the particular ache of that kind of acknowledgement, the recognition that something had been wrong at the foundation, and that continuing it would have required the dismantling of both people. She told him, in exchange, about herself. About Nashville and her parents, her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had been a remarkable cook and musician, both of them taken by a fever outbreak when Louise was 24. About the years she had spent working as a governess for a family there, educating their children, and about the man she had very nearly agreed to marry, a mild-mannered banker's clerk named Howard, who had been pleasant and thoroughly boring and whom she had ultimately declined, a decision she had sometimes regretted when the practical difficulties of her life pressed in, and sometimes felt was the best thing she had ever done. "What stopped you?" Arthur asked from up on the roof. "With Howard." Louise shaded her eyes and looked up at him. "He asked me what my opinion was on a domestic matter once," she said, and when I told him, he laughed and said I had a remarkable imagination. He meant it as a compliment. A pause from above. "Ah," said Arthur McCrae, and there was an entire education in that single syllable. When the roof was repaired, they sat on the small front porch and had Mrs. Boone's cornbread with the preserves and the coffee that Louise made on her stove, and the afternoon went by in the way that afternoons do when you are not watching them, unhurried and full. When he left, he asked if he might call on her again the following Sunday. "You might call on me on a day other than Sunday," Louise said. "Sundays are not special to me." He smiled at that, and it transformed his face in a way that made her stomach do something she had thought it was done doing. "Thursday, then," he said. "I have business in town Thursday morning. I could stop by afterward." "That would be fine," she said. He came on Thursday, and the Sunday after that, and the Thursday after that, and by the end of April they had established a rhythm of visits that the whole town of Millhaven had opinions about, which Louise knew because Mrs. Aldrich stopped her outside the feed store to tell her how pleased she was that the social introduction had worked out so well, and the blacksmith's wife nodded at her in a way that suggested significant knowledge, and Jenny Prout, who was now being courted by a pleasant young cowhand named Davis, asked Louise at the dry goods store whether Arthur McCrae was as serious as he looked. "He is," Louise said, "but he is also quite funny." "You do not seem like a pair," Jenny said, not unkindly, just with the frank assessment of a very young woman who has not yet learned to disguise her thoughts. "He is so quiet and you are so direct," Louise offered. "I was going to say capable," Jenny said, which was kinder than Louise had expected. "But maybe both, maybe both." Louise thought about that on the walk home. She thought about how she and Arthur had argued, genuinely argued, on their last visit about the question of water rights on the plains and the treatment of the smaller homesteaders by the large ranching operations, and how he had disagreed with her initial position and explained his own at considerable length, and then actually listened when she pushed back and said, at the end of it, "You have changed the shape of how I am thinking about this," which was not agreement but was something better. It was the acknowledgement that she had moved his thinking, that her words had weight, that she was a person whose perspective altered the landscape of the conversation. She was falling in love with him. She recognized it with the particular clarity of a woman who had lived enough to understand what she was looking at. It was not the bright, disorienting flash she had expected love to feel like when she was younger. It was something steadier and more pervasive, like the way warmth moves through a house from a good wood fire. You do not notice any single moment of warming, but at some point you realize you are no longer cold. Arthur McCrae was also falling in love with Louise Hart, though he would have been harder pressed to describe it, being a man who had learned to distrust the grand romantic declarations that tended to get people into trouble. What he knew was that he thought about her more than he thought about anything else. He knew that the 12 miles between his ranch and Millhaven felt different now than they had 6 months ago, felt like a specific, measured distance, rather than simply the road between one place and another. He knew that when he sat on his west-facing porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down over the plain in all its extravagant color, he imagined showing it to her. In May, he drove her out to the Double Bar M for the first time. She had asked to see it, directly and without preface, and he had said he would take her on a Saturday when he could give her a proper tour. He came for her in the morning, and they drove out along the plain road with the spring grass bright on either side and the sky enormous and blue above them, and Louise sat beside him on the wagon bench and felt the vast Texas landscape opening around her in a way that was both humbling and exhilarating. The ranch was more than she had anticipated. The main house was large and solidly built of timber and stone, with the west-facing porch he had described, and a kitchen garden on the south side that Mrs. Boone ruled with absolute authority. The outbuildings barn, bunkhouse, smithy, smokehouse were arranged with the kind of practical logic that suggested a man who thought carefully about how things should work. The cattle grazed in the middle distance, a moving dark mass that Louise found unexpectedly beautiful against the yellow-green of the spring range. Mrs. Boone herself was a compact, gray-haired woman of approximately 60 who had been a rancher's wife until her own husband's death, and who had come to work for Arthur McCrae 5 years ago under some arrangement that Louise did not fully understand, but that clearly worked for both parties. She looked at Louise with the frank, measuring gaze of a woman who had been the primary authority in this household for 5 years, and was determining what the arrival of another woman was going to mean. "He told me you fixed a roof," Mrs. Boone said. "He fixed it," Louise said. "I handed up the shingles." "He said you handed them up without being asked how to do it," Mrs. Boone said. "Most women would have asked how to do it." "It was fairly self-evident," Louise said. Mrs. Boone nodded, as though this had confirmed something she needed confirmed, and offered Louise coffee and sat down with her at the kitchen table while Arthur went out to speak with his foreman, a man named Pete Garza, and what followed was perhaps the most direct and clarifying conversation Louise had that entire spring. Mrs. Boone, who had seen Arthur McCrae through his divorce, and through the lean years before the ranch became successful, and through the particular loneliness of a capable man who had made himself self-sufficient because he had no other option, had very decided views about what he needed, and whether Louise was capable of providing it. She was not hostile. She was examining, which was different. She asked Louise about her life and her plans and her opinions, and Louise answered honestly because she had the sense that Mrs. Boone would know immediately if she did not. And at the end of the coffee, Mrs. Boone said, "He does not say much about what he needs. You will have to watch for it." "I have noticed that," Louise said. "But he is honest," Mrs. Boone said. "Completely honest. He will never tell you a comfortable thing if the true thing is harder. That can be difficult to live with." "I prefer it," Louise said. "I thought you might," said Mrs. Boone, and refilled her coffee cup. Arthur showed her the rest of the ranch on horseback, lending her a steady mare named Della who had the patient, good-natured temperament of an animal accustomed to carrying a variety of riders. Louise rode with the competence of someone who had grown up around horses and had simply not done it recently, and Arthur noticed and did not comment, which she appreciated. They rode out across the spring range, and he told her about the land, about the section he was hoping to acquire to the north, about the water source that made the grazing sustainable, about the problem of the drought years and how he managed for them. He talked about the ranch the way she had heard men talk about their children, with the specific, detailed love of someone who had built something over a long time and knew every part of it intimately. "Do you love it?" she asked. "The ranch itself, not the success of it." "The place." He looked out over the plain before he answered. "Yes," he said, "I love it the way you love something you have fought for, not easily." She understood that completely. They ate a midday meal that Mrs. Boone had prepared: salt pork and beans and fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that was one of the finest things Louise had tasted in years. And Pete Garza joined them at the table, a weathered Mexican man of about 50 who had been Arthur's foreman since the 3rd year of the ranch, and who treated Arthur with the particular loyalty of a man who had chosen where his allegiance lay and would not be moved from it. He was polite to Louise in the formal, watchful way of a person who was reserving judgment, and she respected that. After the meal, while Mrs. Boone and Louise were washing up and Arthur and Pete had gone to look at something with one of the cattle, Pete said something to Arthur outside that Louise could not hear, but that made Arthur's face, when he came back in, carry an expression she had not seen on it before, a kind of suppressed, reluctant happiness, like a man who has just received news he very much wanted but is not ready to believe yet. On the drive back to Millhaven in the long, golden late afternoon, they were quiet for a time in the easy way they had developed, a silence that did not require filling, and Louise watched the light on the plain and thought about what it would mean to live in a place like this, and whether she was capable of it, and whether she wanted to be. "I would like to ask you something," Arthur said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has thought carefully about his words. "Then ask," she said. "I am not a man who arrives at things quickly," he said. "I know that about myself. I was slow to come to this ranch, and I was slow to believe in it when I had come, and I am slow with most things that matter. But I am telling you clearly so there is no confusion about my intentions. I am hoping this becomes something permanent." Louise looked at his profile, the strong line of jaw, the gray at his temples, the way he held the reins with a certain careless competence, and felt that warm, steady thing in her chest expand into something larger. "I am hoping the same thing," she said. He reached across the wagon bench without looking away from the road and took her hand, and held it, and they drove the rest of the way into Millhaven in that companionable quiet. June came, and with it the heat, rolling up from the south in great dry waves that turned the landscape from spring green to summer gold. Louise's garden, which she had been slowly reclaiming from the weeds, was producing tomatoes and beans and a struggling row of corn, and she had established a routine of early morning work before the worst of the heat set in. Arthur came on Thursdays and Saturdays now, and twice during June he came on a Tuesday as well, on the excuse of business in town that Louise suspected was less pressing than he made it sound. They had their first real argument in June, a proper one rather than the energetic disagreements about ideas they had been enjoying since the beginning. It was about the homesteaders to the west of the Double Bar M, families who had come under the Homestead Act and were struggling with the land and the weather and the lack of resources, and about a conversation Louise had had with a woman named Mary Hollis who had come into the dry goods store looking for credit she could not get. Louise had gone to speak with Arthur about it because she knew he had dealings with the area and she thought perhaps he could extend some form of help, and what she found instead was that Arthur had recently acquired, through purchase, a section of water rights that effectively cut off one of the smaller homesteaders from reliable access to water. She did not yell. She was not a person who yelled. But she was direct and she was honest, and she told him exactly what she thought about what he had done, and he listened. And when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "You are right." She had expected argument. The flat agreement stopped her. "The acquisition was legal," he said, "and I told myself that was sufficient. I knew it would disadvantage Hollis. I chose to tell myself it was business." He was looking at the middle distance, and his jaw was set in the way she had learned meant he was working through something difficult. "It was not only business." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to work out an arrangement with Hollis about the water," he said. "A shared use agreement. It will cost me something, but it is the fair thing." He looked at her. "I should not have needed you to tell me that." "No," she agreed, gently but honestly, "but you are hearing it now." That was the moment, she would think later, when she understood fully who he was. Not a man without flaws. He had the flaws of his time and his world, the tendencies towards self-serving justification that were almost universal in men who had built something through hard work and needed to protect it. But a man who could hear hard truth and respond to it rather than resist it. A man who was, genuinely, trying to be better than his first instincts. She loved him considerably more after that argument than she had before it. The water arrangement with the Hollis family was worked out by July, and the Hollis family, Tom and Mary and their 3 children, became, over the coming months, something approaching neighbors in the way that counted. Mary Hollis baked Louise a pie in gratitude and told her that Mr. McCrae had been unexpectedly reasonable about the whole thing, and Louise smiled and said she was glad to hear it. Arthur came to town on a Tuesday in mid-July with something clearly on his mind that he spent the better part of an hour walking around the edges of before Louise, sitting across from him at her kitchen table with her coffee and her direct brown gaze, said, "Arthur, just say it." He put down his cup. He looked at her, and then he said, "I would like you to marry me, Louise. I am asking you formally and with full knowledge of what I am asking. I know you are not a woman who makes this kind of decision lightly, and I know that marriage means the giving up of your independence in ways that are not fair, and I know that life on the ranch is hard. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I believe we would be good to each other, and I believe we are already necessary to each other, and I want to build something with you." He paused. "I am also fairly certain that I love you, though I recognize that is a thing I should perhaps have led with." Louise looked at him for a long moment. This steady, complicated, honest man who had taken his hat off in a room full of men who did not, who had fixed her roof and argued with her in good faith, and changed his behavior when she showed him where it was wrong and held her hand on the drive home without making any performance of it. "I love you," she said. "And yes." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her. And it was not a tentative or polite kiss, but a real one, warm and certain and long. And Louise put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating under her palms, and thought that this was the best thing she had felt in a very long time. They were married in September, in the little church on Millhaven's Main Street, in a ceremony that Mrs. Aldridge organized with considerable enthusiasm, and which was attended by what seemed to be most of the town and all of the Double Bar M's workforce. Mrs. Boone sat in the front pew in a dress she had clearly kept for important occasions, and wept with a discretion that did not fool anyone. Pete Garza stood up for Arthur as best man, with the solemn gravity of a man who took the responsibility seriously. Jenny Prout, who had become something approaching a friend over the summer, sat with her Davis and smiled her brilliant, uncomplicated smile, and Louise thought that she wished Jenny well and meant it without any of the complicated emotions she might have expected. Louise wore a dress she had made herself, ivory with blue stitching at the collar and cuffs, and when she walked down the aisle toward Arthur and he looked at her from the front of the church with those steady gray eyes and that suppressed, reluctant happiness that was his particular way of showing how deeply he felt things, she did not look at the room. She looked at him, just him. They drove out to the ranch after the ceremony, and the evening was everything the ranch could offer at its best, the light going down golden over the plain, the grass moving in the early autumn breeze, the big sky carrying its last colors while the first stars came out, and the two of them sitting on the west-facing porch with glasses of the good whiskey Pete had produced for the occasion, listening to the quiet. "This is what I imagined showing you," Arthur said about the sunset. "I know," Louise said. "You told me. Does it match what you expected?" She looked at the sky, at the vast burning color of it, at the land dark beneath it and the first light of stars appearing in the east, and she thought that it was in fact more than she had expected, more generous and more extravagant, and that this was also true of him. "Better," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they sat there until the stars were fully out, and the night was cool and quiet around them. And it was one of the most peaceful moments Louise could remember, and she held it carefully in her chest like a candle she did not want to blow out. The first winter of their marriage taught Louise what the ranch was in its more difficult aspects. It was not a peaceful or pretty life in the way that the September evening had suggested. It was demanding and physical and full of unexpected crises, animals and weather and equipment being the primary antagonists. There was a stretch in January when a blue norther came down from the north, and the temperature dropped to something that froze the water in the troughs overnight, and every person on the ranch was working around the clock to keep the cattle alive and the pipes from bursting and the horses from injury, and Louise was in it alongside all of them, pulling on her heavy coat and her boots, and doing what needed doing without being asked to or being told how. Arthur watched her those days with a look she had not seen before and could not quite name. It was not surprise, exactly. He had not thought her incapable. It was something more like recognition, like seeing something he had believed in confirmed by the actual sight of it. At the end of the worst of the cold, when they finally came in from a long morning's work, and Mrs. Boone put hot coffee and breakfast on the table, and everyone sat down with the particular exhausted relief of people who had fought something together and won, Arthur looked at her across the table and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You are the best thing that has come to this ranch." She wanted to say something gracious and modest in return, but what she actually said, because she was tired and happy and entirely herself, was, "I know." He laughed, and it was the full laugh she had heard only a few times, the one that was not the dry humor but the genuine, uncomplicated delight, and Mrs. Boone looked up from the stove with an expression of complete satisfaction, and Pete Garza, who had overheard, smiled into his coffee cup. The spring of 1883 brought changes to the surrounding country that Louise and Arthur watched with the attention of people who understood that the land around them was not separate from their lives. The cattle trails were changing. The great drives north along the Kishom Trail that had been the lifeblood of Texas ranching for over a decade were becoming less viable as the railroads pushed further into the state, bringing the markets closer, but also bringing the settlers who were fencing the open range. And the political conversations in Millhaven and across the region were increasingly contentious. There were arguments about fencing, about the barbed wire that the settlers used to define their homestead claims, and that the open-range ranchers believed constituted a dangerous restriction on their traditional ways of moving cattle. Arthur had opinions about this, as he had opinions about most things, and they were not always simple ones. He was a large rancher who stood to gain from unfettered access to the open range, and he was also a man who had, since Louise, been developing a more nuanced view of what fair treatment of smaller landholders looked like. He and Louise argued about the fence-cutting incidents that were beginning to occur across the region, in which ranchers or their hands cut the wire fences of homesteaders to maintain access to water and grazing, and Louise held firm that this was wrong regardless of the economic pressures behind it. And Arthur, who agreed with her, but was also feeling pressure from neighboring ranchers who expected him to side with the large cattle interests, worked out his position more slowly. "Your neighbors are watching what you do," Louise told him one evening on the porch, in the way she had of naming the actual stakes of a thing. "Not just the Holly's family, everyone. What you do about the fence cutting tells them what kind of man you are." "I know what kind of man I am," he said. "Then let them know it too," she said. He gave a speech at the Millhaven Cattle Association meeting that April that surprised several people in the room, including some who had expected him to take the rancher's side uncritically. He did not pretend that the economic pressures were not real, or that the changes coming to the range were not genuinely difficult for the established operations. But he said, clearly and on record, that cutting other people's fences was theft and destruction of property, and that he would not sanction it on the Double Bar M's behalf, and that the ranching community needed to find legal and negotiated paths forward rather than taking the law into their own hands. It made him unpopular with 2 or 3 of the neighboring ranchers, men he had been on reasonably good terms with for years. It made him considerably more respected by everyone else, including Pete Garza, who had been watching American ranching politics with the particular attentiveness of a man who knew that Mexican landholders had been dispossessed by exactly these kinds of legal and extra-legal maneuvers a generation earlier. Louise heard about the speech from Mrs. Aldridge, who had heard it from someone else, and when Arthur came home she did not mention that she had heard about it, just waited to see if he would tell her himself. He told her over supper. "I said what I thought," he said simply. "I heard," she said. He looked up. "News travels fast." "Small town," she said, and he smiled. It was in the early summer of 1883, on a warm June morning when Louise had been at the ranch for 9 months, that Mrs. Boone appeared in the kitchen doorway with a look that was simultaneously satisfied and carefully neutral, and said, "Are you going to tell him today?" Louise was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of sewing and looked up. "I was thinking this evening," she said. "He will notice before this evening if he has not already," Mrs. Boone said. "The man is not unobservant." Louise put down the sewing. She had known for about 2 weeks, had been carrying the knowledge around with the particular private quality of something that is yours alone before it becomes shared, turning it over in her mind, and feeling the full shape of it before she let the world in. She was pregnant. She was 33 years old and pregnant for the first time, and she felt, underneath the nervousness and the practical concern, a bone-deep happiness about it that she had not expected to feel so straightforwardly. Arthur was in the yard when she found him, talking with Pete about something to do with the north pasture fence, and she waited until Pete had excused himself with the good instincts of a man who could read a room even when the room was outdoors. Arthur looked at her face. "What is it?" he said, not with alarm but with that specific attentiveness. "We are going to have a child," she said. He was very still for a moment, and then he crossed the space between them and put both his arms around her and held her, not saying anything, just holding her, and she could feel the breath he let out against her hair, and knew it was a breath he had been holding for a long time. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said, her voice somewhat muffled by his shoulder. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Considerably," he said, and then quietly, "but I am also the happiest I have been in my life." She pulled back enough to look at him, and his face was doing that thing it did, that suppressed, reluctant happiness, except that it was not suppressed at all right now. It was fully out, unguarded, and he looked younger and more open than she had ever seen him look, and she put her hand against his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips briefly to her palm. Mrs. Boone made a celebration supper that evening that involved entirely too much food for 3 people, and Pete was invited in from the bunkhouse, and the evening went late with good food and conversation, and the particular warmth of people who have become a genuine small community and are celebrating something real. The son was born in January of 1884, in a hard labor that lasted most of a day and night, and that left Louise exhausted and aching and utterly triumphant, with a boy who had Arthur's gray eyes and Louise's dark hair, and an opinion about the world that he expressed at considerable volume from the first moment. They named him James Hart McCrae, the Hart for Louise's family, and Arthur held him for the first time with the hands of a man who had handled cattle and rope and hard weather, and who was now holding something entirely different. His large, capable hands cradling the small head with such careful deliberateness that Louise, watching from the bed, felt the love she had for him double in a moment, simply overflow its previous shape and become something larger. "Hello, James," Arthur said in that low, unhurried voice to the baby in his arms. "I have a great deal to show you." James McCrae was a healthy and energetic child, who grew with the particular determination of someone who had been told by example that determination was the appropriate response to any situation. He was walking by 10 months and talking with uncomfortable clarity by 18 months, and by the time he was 2 years old, he was following Pete Garza around the ranch yard with the focused attention of an apprentice, Pete being patient with the small shadow in the way of a man who had never had children of his own, and was unexpectedly delighted by this one. Mrs. Boone, who had declared herself something between a housekeeper and a grandmother on the day James was born, and had not been contradicted by anyone, taught him the names of the kitchen herbs and the proper way to hold a spoon, and a great many songs she had known from her own childhood that Louise did not recognize but found herself learning by osmosis. The years from 1884 to 1887 were the making years, as Louise thought of them afterward, the years when the double bar M became fully what Arthur had always meant it to be, and when the family on the ranch became fully themselves. The cattle operation grew, the land acquisition to the north was finally secured through straightforward purchase, and the relationship between the double bar M and the smaller homesteaders in the surrounding area became, through a combination of Arthur's decisions and Louise's active cultivation, something genuinely cooperative. Mary Holly's had become one of Louise's closest friends. The Holly's children came to the ranch regularly in the summers, and James McCrae went to the Holly's homestead with equal frequency, and the kind of community that was built in those back-and-forth exchanges was the kind that held when things were difficult. Things were difficult, periodically. There was a drought in the summer of 1886 that hit the whole region hard, and the double bar M lost a significant portion of the herd to the combination of heat and poor grass. And Arthur and Pete worked 18-hour days through the worst of it, while Louise managed the household and the supply situation with the focused pragmatism that was her particular form of strength. There was a sickness that moved through the bunkhouse in the winter of 1885 that took one of the younger hands, a boy of 19 from Georgia named Sam Whitmore, and Louise sat with him through his last night, because she thought no one should die without someone present, and she was the one who could be there. And Arthur stood in the yard the next morning looking at the plane with the expression of a man who understood both that death is part of life, and that this particular fact does not make it less. They grieved these things. They held each other through the hard times and got up the next morning and kept going, because that was what you did, and because they were people who understood that the life they had was built on continuing. Louise discovered she was pregnant again in the spring of 1887, which was a different experience from the first time in that she was no longer surprised by the signs of it and considerably more confident about what to expect. And Arthur was considerably less frightened and considerably more immediately jubilant, having apparently been of the opinion that James needed a sibling for some time. This was confirmed when James, who was 3 and had been let into the information carefully, said, "I already have a plan for teaching them how to ride Della," and returned to his block building with the focused efficiency of a person whose relevant decisions have been made. The second child was born in October of 1887, a girl they named Clara after Louise's Aunt Louise's idea, and when she told Arthur the reason, he sat with it for a moment and then said, "She sounds like someone worth remembering," which was exactly the right response. Clara McCrae arrived in the world with considerably less drama than her brother had, being apparently of a more composed temperament from the beginning, and where James had opinions he expressed loudly, Clara had observations she expressed with a quiet intensity that, as she grew, everyone on the ranch agreed was entirely her father. In the months and years after Clara's birth, Louise found herself looking at her life in the occasional quiet moment, at the ranch that had become hers as much as Arthur's, at the children who were both her and him in different proportions, and who were growing with the particular wild directness of children raised in open country, at Mrs. Boone, who had become as much family as any blood relation, at Pete Garza, who had taken both children under his considerable wing and was teaching James to rope with patient expertise, at Arthur himself, who was grayer at the temples now and more weathered by the sun, and who was, she thought, the finest man she had ever known in the particular way that fine means fully made, complete in itself, nothing essential missing. He came and found her one evening in the late summer of 1888, when James was 4 and Clara not yet a year, and Louise had gotten a rare half-hour of quiet on the west porch, while Mrs. Boone held the baby and James had exhausted himself into an early sleep. Arthur came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her, and then came and sat beside her without saying anything, and they watched the sun going down together the way they had the first evening of their marriage. "What are you thinking?" he said after a while. "I am thinking," she said, "about the social introduction." He was quiet for a moment. "That is where your mind goes. Only to compare," she said, "where I thought I was then and where I am now." She looked at the golden sky. "I thought I was going home to write to my sister about coming back to Nashville. I thought my particular story was more or less finished, and I was going to have to find something practical to do with the remainder of it. And instead," he said. "And instead," she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him as she had that first night, and the plain spread out before them in the last light, full of their cattle and their grass and the low structures of their working life. And the sky was extraordinary, as it always was, as it always seemed to find new ways to be. "I want to tell you something," Arthur said. "Then tell me, when Mrs. Aldrich called your name in that room," he said slowly, and you stepped forward and looked at the room, I want you to know that I had already been watching you for most of that hour. Before your name was called." He paused. "I had been watching you standing in that line and thinking that whoever you were the most fully present person in the room. And then they called your name and said you were 32 and the whole room moved away from you and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" she said gently. "I thought that the room was making an error that I was not obliged to make," he said. "So I did not make it." Louise Hart McCrae sat on the west porch of the Double Bar M with her husband's arm around her, and the best sunset she could remember coloring the Texas sky above the land they had built together. And she thought that she had been 32 years old and exhausted and nearly out of money, and standing in a line being passed over, and that this man had been in the back of the room choosing differently than everyone else, and that all of it, every single difficult piece of the road that had led here, had been worth it to arrive at this particular evening. "Arthur," she said. "Louise, I am glad you spoke up." "So am I," he said, "every day." The years continued to build, as years do when they are lived in fully. The Double Bar M grew into one of the most respected operations in the county, not only for its size but for the way it was run fairly, with attention to the people who worked it and the land that sustained it. Arthur's reputation in the Cattle Association had recovered from the fence-cutting controversy, and had in fact been enhanced by it, in the long view, as the men who had resented his independence had come to understand that he had been right. The range was changing regardless, and the men who had tried to hold it through force had ultimately lost more than those who had negotiated. Louise took on the teaching of the ranch hands' children in 1889, when it became clear that the nearest schoolhouse was too far for the families who had settled on properties adjacent to the Double Bar M. She set up a classroom of sorts in the ranch house's large front room on weekday mornings, teaching 6 children who ranged from James at 5 to a 9-year-old girl named Rosa Garza, Pete's niece who had come to live with him after her parents' deaths. And this teaching, which she had originally thought of as a practical solution to a practical problem, turned out to be one of the most satisfying things she had done. The school teacher's position she had once wanted finding its way to her in the end after all. Arthur built a proper schoolroom addition onto the house in 1890, a room with good windows and whitewashed walls and actual school desks that were ordered from a supplier in San Antonio, because he had seen how seriously she took it and thought it deserved to be taken as seriously in terms of space and equipment. The morning he showed it to her, leading her around the side of the house with a hand over her eyes and then removing it, she stood in the doorway of the bright, clean room and felt the particular fullness of a person who has been thoroughly seen by another. "This is remarkable," she said. "It is a room," he said. "It is more than a room," she said. "You know that." "Yes," he said quietly. "I know that." James McCrae went off to a proper school in Millhaven when he was 7, then to a boarding school in San Antonio that Louise chose carefully, and Arthur paid for without complaint, because he believed in what Louise said about education being the primary inheritance a person could give a child. He came back for summers and holidays as a boy who was becoming something genuinely excellent, thoughtful, and capable, and to Louise's deep pleasure, a reader who got into correspondences with his mother about books and had opinions about them that were sometimes wrong in interesting ways. Clara was quieter than her brother and went deeper into things than he did, and took to mathematics with a precision that fascinated both her parents, and Pete Garza taught her to rope with the same patient expertise he had given James, and she learned it faster. She had Arthur's gray eyes and his way of looking at a thing with full attention, and she had Louise's directness when she chose to deploy it, and the combination was something that would, Louise thought, be formidable in a grown woman. In 1891, Pete Garza told Arthur and Louise over supper one evening that he was planning to go back to Mexico, to a region near Sonora where he had family and property that had been his father's. He was 60 years old, he said, and there were things he wanted to see again before he was too old to travel. He said this with the characteristic directness that was one of the things Louise most respected about him, and the supper table was quiet for a moment. "We will miss you considerably," Arthur said, and meant it in the full weight of the word. "You will find a good foreman," Pete said. "The ranch is well enough established that it will not struggle." He looked at Louise. "You will manage." "We will," Louise said, "but we will miss you considerably," as he said. Pete left in March with a proper farewell that involved the whole ranch gathering and Mrs. Boone producing an extraordinary meal and Rosa Garza weeping with a fullness that spoke to the depth of her uncle's role in her life, though Pete himself received the farewell with characteristic composure. He shook Arthur's hand and embraced Louise, which was not something he had done before, and which told her exactly how he felt about what they had meant to each other. He left a letter for James and Clara that Louise read to them that evening, a letter full of the particular practical wisdom of a man who had spent 60 years watching how the world actually worked, and which ended with the sentence, "Your parents are good people who chose each other well. Do not take that lightly." The new foreman was a man named Daniel Rivera, Pete's recommendation, 35 and solid and good with the land and with people, and he settled into the double bar M's rhythms with a competence that spoke well of Pete's judgment. Louise turned 40 in 1890 and marked the occasion with more equanimity than she had marked 32, which she thought was one of the more pleasing inversions of expectation. She was in a life that was fully hers, in a place she had made her own, with a man who looked at her across the breakfast table on that morning with something in his face that was too deep and steady to be called simply love, though love was the closest word she had. He had given her a gift that morning, a small package wrapped in paper, which contained a copy of Thoreau's Walden with a note inside that said, "I finally got back to it. I thought you should have it." It was the same book he had mentioned that first afternoon at the general store's side table, 8 years ago, and he had remembered. Of course he had remembered. She held the book in her hands and looked at the note and felt 8 years of accumulated certainty and love move through her like the warmth from a good wood fire, full and quiet and absolutely sure of itself. 8 years, she said. 8 years, he agreed from across the breakfast table with his coffee and his steady gray eyes. "Are you glad?" "I am glad every day," she said, "some days more loudly than others." He smiled. "How loud today?" "Very," she said, "very loud today." Mrs. Boone, who was 70 and had announced approximately 5 times over the last 3 years that she was going to retire and had not done so, brought more coffee and declined to comment on the conversation, though her expression said everything that needed saying. In the winter of 1892, Arthur was ill. It was not a light illness. It was a serious one, a chest sickness that moved in hard and stayed for 3 weeks and left him thinner and quieter than Louise had ever seen him. And the nights of those 3 weeks were the worst she had experienced in her adult life, lying beside him, listening to him breathe and willing the sound to stay steady. She did not allow herself to think about what she would do if she lost him. She focused on what needed doing, the fever management, the broth that needed making, the communications with the doctor in Millhaven who came twice and left instructions, the ranch operations that needed managing while Arthur was down, which she handled with Daniel Rivera, and with her own now decade of knowledge of how the double bar M worked. Arthur recovered. He came through the worst of it on a Thursday morning in February when Louise woke to find the fever had broken, and he was lying looking at the ceiling with the quality of a man who has returned from somewhere far. "Good morning," she said. "I am sorry," he said. His voice was hoarse and thin. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. "I frightened you," he said. "Yes," she said, because she was not going to lie to him. "Very much." He turned his head and looked at her, and his gray eyes were clearer than they had been in 3 weeks. "I thought about you," he said. "When it was bad, I thought if I do not recover, she will manage. She is more than capable of managing, but I did not want her to have to." Louise put her hand against his face, which was dry and warm in the good way now rather than the dangerous way, and she thought that this was what it meant to be known by someone, that they worried not about your capability but about the weight of what you would have to carry. "You recovered," she said. "I recovered," he said. "Then we are done discussing it," she said. "You are going to rest for the next 2 weeks and eat what Mrs. Boone makes you and not go near the cattle or the fence line until you are fully well, and I am going to be next to you, and this is not negotiable." "No," he said, with a ghost of the dry humor. "I did not suppose it was." He was fully recovered by March and back at his work in April, and the spring of 1892 had the quality of something reclaimed, something held more carefully for having nearly been lost. Louise found herself looking at him often that spring with a fullness of feeling that she did not always have words for. At the way he moved through the ranch in the early morning, at the set of his shoulders in the light, at his hands around a coffee cup, at his face when he was reading, which was the most unguarded version of his face, open and entirely present. James came home from school in San Antonio in the summer of 1893, at 15, with the specific restlessness of a boy who has been away long enough to start forming his own ideas about what his life should be. And Louise and Arthur navigated this with the care it required, giving him room to push and holding the necessary limits, having actual conversations rather than issuing pronouncements, trusting that the foundation was solid enough to hold the testing. James wanted to be a lawyer. He had decided this with the certainty of a 15-year-old who had read enough to know that the world was shaped by its laws and that he wanted to be one of the people shaping it. Arthur, who had built his life through the work of his hands and who had complicated feelings about lawyers in the abstract, listened to his son explain this with attention and genuine respect and said at the end, "Then we had better think about how to educate you properly for it." "Are you disappointed?" James asked. "That I do not want the ranch." "The ranch will find its way," Arthur said. "I want you to find yours." Louise watched this exchange from across the room and thought that he had become, in the years of parenthood, even more than she had already known him to be. Clara, at 6, was less interested in her future and more interested in the horses, which was a passion she had been developing with single-minded intensity since she was 4, and which had resulted in her being, by anyone's honest assessment, a remarkably good small rider. She had gone beyond Della, and was now riding a younger horse named Copper with a confidence that occasionally made Louise nervous, and that Arthur watched with unconcealed pride. In 1894, Rosa Garza, who had been a student in Louise's schoolroom for 5 years and was now 14, received a letter from her Uncle Pete in Mexico. He had settled well on the family property in Sonora and sent for her to join him if she wished. He wrote that the choice was entirely hers, that she had a home at the Double Bar M for as long as she needed it, but that he had family land that would be hers eventually, and that she should know it. Rosa brought the letter to Louise, who read it with her at the kitchen table, and then they talked about it for a long time, the way Louise had learned to talk with young people, not directing but opening up the terrain of the question so they could find their own way through it. Rosa was a serious and capable girl who had been through the early loss of her parents and had built a strength around it that was not hardness but was resilience, and she knew her own mind. She decided to go. Arthur and Louise saw her off at the Millhaven stagecoach station in the spring of 1894 with a packed trunk and enough money to make the journey safely, and Rosa embraced Louise with the full intensity of someone who knows they are leaving something they will always carry with them. "You taught me well," Rosa said. "You learned well," Louise said. "That is different and more important." They heard from her by letter over the following years. She settled in Sonora, learned the land, eventually took on the management of her uncle's property with a competence that Pete wrote about with straightforward pride. The Double Bar M continued, and the family on it continued, and the community around it continued. Millhaven grew in the 1890s as the railroad finally reached it, and the town that had seemed like a rough frontier outpost began to acquire the characteristics of a real small city: more shops, a proper school building, a doctor's office that was not just the occasional visiting physician, a newspaper. Louise contributed to the newspaper, occasionally, with pieces about the ranch and about the region's history, and about the small school she still ran, which had expanded as more families came to the area, and which she increasingly thought of as the work she was most proud of outside of her children. She was 44 in 1892 when it was clear the schoolroom had outgrown the ranch house, and 46 when the community school that was built in Millhaven's expanding outskirts was named. At a town meeting she did not attend because she had not been informed it was on the agenda: the Hart schoolhouse. Arthur came home from that meeting with an expression she recognized as the fully out version of his suppressed happiness. "They named a school after you," he said. Louise looked at him. "What?" "The new community schoolhouse," he said. "It is now called the Hart Schoolhouse. It was unanimous." Louise was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father, who had been a schoolteacher in Nashville and whose name she carried, and she thought about the 32-year-old woman who had stood in a line at a social introduction and been passed over and thought her story was more or less finished. "Hart," she said, "that is my name." "It has always been your name," Arthur said. McCrae did not replace it. "You kept it." She had. Louise Hart McCrae she had always been, the Hart by insistence and by love of what it signified. "We should go look at it," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight Mrs. Boone made a pie." Mrs. Boone's pies had remained, across all the years, one of the fundamental certainties of the Double Bar M, and Louise thought that some things should remain exactly as they were, which was another way of saying thank you to the life she was living. By 1896, James McCrae was 18 and preparing to go to a proper law school in Austin, a prospect that cost a significant amount of money and that Arthur arranged without complaint and with what Louise recognized as genuine pride. They drove him to the Millhaven train station in August, a train station now, the railroad having changed everything, and James stood on the platform with his trunk and his good clothes and his serious, earnest face that had in it both of his parents' best qualities, and Arthur shook his hand and held it. "You will do well," Arthur said. "I intend to," James said. Louise embraced him and held him for a moment longer than she had meant to, and when she stepped back his eyes were bright in a way he was managing with characteristic McCrae composure. "Right," she said. "Every week," he said, and he meant it, and he did. Clara, at 9, watched her brother's train leave from beside her father and slipped her hand into Arthur's and said, "I am not going anywhere yet." "No," Arthur said. "You are staying right here." "For a while," Clara clarified, which made Louise bite back a smile, because the girl was entirely herself and always had been. "For a while" was correct. Clara McCrae would go eventually, in her own time and on her own terms, to wherever her particular combination of precision and wildness took her, and that was as it should be. But for now she was 9 years old and she was home, and the ranch was full of its ordinary life, and the Texas sky was doing its extravagant best over the plain, and Arthur was standing in the yard with their daughter's hand in his, watching a train disappear into the distance and looking, from where Louise stood at the platform's edge, exactly like everything she had been given that she had not expected to receive. She walked across the platform to where he was standing, and he reached out without looking and took her hand as she came alongside him, as naturally as breathing, as certain as any of the things they had built between them over the 14 years since he had spoken up from the back of a room, and asked if he might speak with a woman the rest of the room had already dismissed. "Ready to go home," he said. "Yes," Louise said, and meant every word of it. The home that was the ranch and the home that was him and the home that was this life she had never predicted and could not imagine doing without. They drove back out along the Millhaven road in the afternoon light, the same road they had driven together the first time she came to the ranch, the same road that was now as familiar to her as the back of her own hand. The plain stretched out on either side, full of late summer grass and the particular golden quality of Texas light in August, and Clara sat between them on the wagon bench and talked about something she had observed about Copper's left rear shoe. And Arthur listened and Louise listened, and the conversation had the ease of people who have nothing to prove to each other and nothing to fear from each other, who are simply themselves together in the particular grace of a life that has been built and kept and loved. Daniel Rivera raised a hand in greeting when they pulled into the ranch yard, and the barn smell and the dust and the familiar sound of the windmill came at them in the good way, the way of return, and Mrs. Boone appeared in the kitchen doorway with her apron on, and the particular expression that meant there was something cooking on the stove worth being interested in. "I made a roast," she said. "James would not eat it before he left, so there is extra." "We will do our best," Louise said, climbing down from the wagon. "You always do," Mrs. Boone said, and went back inside. Arthur unhitched the horses and Louise went to change out of her town clothes, and Clara was already in the yard with Copper, checking the shoe she had been worrying about, and the ranch settled back into its evening rhythms, the way it always did, sure and sustained, and the light came off the plain in its long August slant and painted everything gold. On the porch that evening after supper, after Clara was in bed and Mrs. Boone had gone to her rooms and Daniel Rivera had returned to the bunkhouse, Arthur and Louise sat in the quiet and watched the stars come out over the plain, the same stars they had watched on their first night here, more of them visible than any city allowed, the full extravagant inventory of the Texas sky. "James is going to be a good lawyer," Arthur said. "He is," Louise said. "He is going to be someone people trust when things are hard." "He has that from you," Arthur said. "He has it from both of us," she said, and felt him concede this with a small movement of the shoulder she was leaning against. They were quiet for a time. Somewhere out on the range a coyote called and was answered, and then the night was quiet again. "Louise," he said. "Yes." "I have been thinking," he said, in the way of a man who has been thinking about something for some time and has arrived at his conclusion. "Tell me. I think this has been a good life," he said, "what we have made here." She considered this. The ranch and the years and the children and the people and the arguments and the hard winters and the good summers and the grief and the joy, and all of it woven together into something that was specifically theirs, that bore the mark of both of them equally, that could not have been what it was without either of them. "It has been an extraordinary life," she said, "in the literal sense, out of the ordinary, more than ordinary." She paused. "I was going to write to my sister. I know. I was going to go back to Nashville and find something practical to do. I know." "Instead," she said. "Instead," he agreed. She turned her head and looked at him in the dark, the silver at his temples and the lines of his weathered face and those steady gray eyes that had found her across a crowded room, and decided she was worth speaking to when the rest of the room had already moved on. And she thought that there was no calculation she could perform that would adequately measure what that moment had given her. "You spoke up," she said. "I would do it 100 times," he said. "You would only need to do it once," she said. "It was sufficient." He laughed, the real laugh, warm and unguarded, and put his arm around her, and she settled into his side with the ease of 14 years of practice. And the stars did what they had always done above the double bar. Turned slowly in their great wheel over the Texas plain, indifferent to everything and present for all of it. And Arthur McCrae and Louise Hart sat on their west-facing porch in the quiet of a night that was entirely theirs and entirely enough, and held each other in the way of people who have been given something remarkable and know it. The double bar went on being what it was: working land, living land, the physical record of what two people could build when they chose each other fully and kept choosing. And the Hart Schoolhouse in Millhaven went on teaching children whose parents had come from everywhere and were becoming something together. And James McCrae sent his weekly letters from Austin and was, by all accounts, becoming the kind of lawyer who listened first and argued second, which was the best kind. And Clara McCrae grew up on the ranch with the horses and the books and the precise, wild quality that was entirely her own, and would one day go to wherever her particular life led her. But that was a story still being written. And on ordinary evenings, when the day's work was done and the supper was finished, and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, Louise Hart McCrae and Arthur McCrae sat together in the life they had made, in the love they had built one honest conversation at a time, in the full and particular satisfaction of people who had found each other by improbable means at an improbable moment, and had not let the improbability make them doubt the truth of what they had found. This was enough. This was more than enough. This was everything.